Good morning.
Bom dia, Diante.
I am glad to interview you. One of the main objectives of these conversations is to disseminate the bioenergetic analysis, spread our technique, especially for the younger audience, new students. We know that your experience within our approach is deep and full of challenges. Scott was our president for 2 terms, and he worked hard and very well in that role. I know that you have good and exciting things to tell us. If we have time at the end of your speech, I ask questions. Can you start, please? And thank you again.
Obrigado. I don't know if I have exciting things. I have difficult things. For some time, I have been engaged in a project of understanding on the deepest somatopsychic level that I'm capable of, a question that has been really central to psychotherapy from the beginning, and certainly from the time of an organized understanding, which is to formulate some comprehension of human destructiveness. So I have entitled this talk, my part of it, Encountering Evil in the Other and Oneself, a project for bioenergetic analysis. But I want to start, before I get into that, with a salutation to our new IIBA president, Cristina Piaui. She follows a line of illustrious women leaders in the IIBA, including one as executive director and our most recent past president. My mentor in organizational leadership guided me many years ago to see that the role of a leader is to take people where they want to go. And I know Cristina to be a thoughtful and caring person. She will now have to use those characteristics to help us define the values which will inform the work of our organization, and to recruit members to bring that vision to fruition. As the first IIBA president from Latin America, she confirms our dedication to an organization that embraces all who are committed to these values. And we are very unusual in our worldwide membership and in our inclusivity. And that is an effort that we make. Those of us who have been on the board of trustees, we have made it in a very concrete way, meeting after meeting, finding ways to talk to each other across languages, across customs, across even different values. And I am grateful to her for taking the lead at this time. So let me get into what I want to share with you all of what I have been struggling with, interested in, and I feel is crucial to our work as therapists and as bioenergetic therapists. The current pandemic has shed further light, I think, on the eruption of destructiveness in the world. All over the world, as in our 2 countries, Danchi, and I say that because your country is also mine.
Yeah.
I have 2 stepdaughters, a sister-in-law and a mother-in-law, and family and friends there. So It is no longer a place I read about in the newspaper. It's my home, and these are my family. The leadership in that country and here in my country and in other countries to which I belong by virtue of heritage and family and colleagues all over the world now, China, Russia, Poland, Italy, Hungary, Israel. In many of these places, perhaps in all, sadly, that I just mentioned, now it occurs to me, the leadership espouses positions with which I do not only disagree, but I also think are morally wrong. We see in these places the kind of hatred that is permeating our environment, but it is not new. And since it's not new, it behooves us to understand its origins. Personally, I have more and more over my career and the study of this in myself and others come to believe that this destructiveness finds its source in the chronic relational trauma, as my late wife Elaine named it, that begins in families. And I think we make a mistake when we do not connect what we see in the macro environment around us to the micro environment. I found myself recently saying to someone, which surprised me at the vehemence of it, that if I try to tell someone that the person being lynched is their father, I have passed a certain line in my own willingness to identify the collective evil as personal and as a representation and manifestation of that with which we all grow up. Perhaps not in our immediate family, perhaps in the extended family, perhaps in the peer family, but it starts there. But many people do not agree with me about this, many people. So I take that as some indication of the possibility of mistake or inadequacy in my position. Still in all, I think that we are obliged to make an effort to understand this phenomenon of destructiveness and of so many people feeling and expressing such hateful and destructive attitudes and acting on them. So this is the project for me. It's of personal necessity, but I think also professionally and socially and ethically, it's required that we investigate it, that we embrace the problem to understand it. Here's a little bit of what I have come to. In 1968, I remember cruising in my 1960 VW Bug the streets of the Hill District in Pittsburgh, in Pennsylvania, here in the United States. I was an undergraduate at the university there. And I went out to see what happened after the rioting that took place after the murder of Martin Luther King Jr. This was the first time that I saw soldiers with assault rifles on US city streets, a very common vision in other places around the world every day. The fight over the Vietnam War had polarized the country as it is polarized now. Those of us old enough to remember that, remember bitter, hateful violence between groups, within families, very much as it is today.
Mm.
The murder and exploitation of the weak and the vulnerable has continued since then. Yes, it ebbs and flows. As any Jew who knows Jewish history knows, there is a continuous cycle of good kings and bad kings, good queens and bad queens, but there is an arc that sadly does not bend toward justice, but repeats, returns to paranoia and to murder and to malevolence again and again. How does our field understand this enduring phenomenon of exploitation and abuse that finds its justification in such intense negativity? Sigmund Freud abandoned the seduction theory. This theory was based on what is now incontrovertible evidence of an enduring pandemic of child sexual exploitation and abuse.
Yeah.
To some extent, his choices are understandable to me. As a coward, I would prefer not to have to stand up to the powers that be and tell them things that they don't want to hear. And to some extent, our whole field has been reluctant to undertake a militant and thoroughgoing analysis of the abusive behavior that underlies the suffering we experience and we see in our patients. When I was first in graduate school, the first professor I had who taught the introduction to clinical psychology was a very beloved professor, and I'm very grateful to him. He was my dissertation advisor and a supervisor. He was very kind to me and very supportive, and I think a deeply caring human being. And he said to us one day in class, he said, so when you get to the bottom of the neurotic process, what's there? And, you know, we were a high-powered bunch of young people, most of us were, and we wanted to be smart and we wanted to be good at what we were doing, and we thought this question through and went back and forth. And he said finally, well, what I would say is nothing. There's nothing there. And I thought to myself, that can't be right. That is an idea about neurotic processes, self and other destructive and defeating processes, that says that they stem from internal, fantastical reactions and responses, and that once one sees that, one can correct those distortions and live in reality. I'm both interested in how destructiveness comes about and equally interested in how we ignore it, which we do. I can appreciate Freud's late in life pessimism. After all, he barely and only luckily escaped the engine of evil that destroyed members of his family and most of the members of his group, Jews in Europe. Had that evil continued to spread as it could have, I would not be here speaking to you today.
Yeah.
In our particular end of the field, Reich, Wilhelm Reich, and Alexander Lowen were utopians. I don't think people necessarily know this, but the early group of psychoanalysts around Freud were very politically active. Freud persuaded the Vienna City Council to open a mental health clinic that would treat working people free of charge. These were not people who were living in the supposed ivory tower. And certainly Reich was intensively involved in an effort to take the principles of psychoanalysis and apply them to political action. That's a process that persists in my family to this day. I suddenly realized I hadn't thought of this before. And I admire it tremendously. But they were utopians. They believed that discharging the negative and toxic energy and feelings and residua,
Master,
attitudes.
sorry, Reich and Freud, or Reich and Lowen?
Reich and Lowen.
And Lowen, Utopics,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, in different ways, but utopians. They believe that if people discharge this pent-up toxic emotional energy and the attitudes that came with that, these were engendered by social oppression and frustration of healthy human needs, that the expression of that, the discharge of that toxicity would lead to the emergence of a naturally good person, naturally good, naturally self-regulating, a kind of Rousseauian idea. My life's work on myself and with patients tells me that this is an incorrect understanding. So utopian ideas are useful as inspiration and aspiration, but they're not very useful as day in, day out working principles when I'm up to my armpits in human misery, my own and other people's, and our destructiveness. My experience as a young adult with the civil rights movement here in the United States, and then with the women's movement, with the anti-war movement, with the movement for respect for and freedom for people of different sexual orientation to be themselves and live as they are, with all of these different consciousness expanding and growing movements, my experience with that taught me, along with many other people, far more deeply understanding this than I do, that the work of us who believe we are working for justice is not only on behalf of those who are oppressed and abused, not only what we are doing for them, but also the work is with myself as someone who embodies the same attitudes I deplore in others.
Yeah.
These attitudes are very deep and they're very ingrained. I'll give you a little concrete example. I run out in Central Park very early every morning. There are not very many people, so I don't have too many conflicts to deal with. And I was running my usual route, and a man was running toward me, sort of young, middle-aged man, big, strong-looking guy, no mask. And then there was a man walking beside me, ahead of me, no mask. Normally, I would go to the far right. I'm sort of a US driver. I move to the right. But now I was kind of trapped. I run with a mask under my chin. I pick it up when I'm near people. I understand the science quite well. I don't feel at risk. I don't think I'm posing a risk. I'm pretty careful. But I also want people to feel comfortable, and I want to feel comfortable. So I was caught. If I move to the right, I'm too close to this man who's just walking. If I stay in the middle, I'm not 2 meters away from either one of them. I'm sort of caught here, and I'm running, so I'm not in my most clear mind, if I ever am. I'm not then. So I made a decision to go far left, which is unusual. And I put my mask up. It's okay with me that he's not wearing a mask. I don't have an issue with that. As he goes by me, he says, "You should move to the right." And I wanted to kill him. I didn't just want to get angry. I wanted to go after him and kill him. The surge of rage tells me that I am in a moment of my own history. The moment when the converging dimensions, what's nowadays called intersectionality, the converging dimensions of my personal history, my experiences as a boy and a man, because my experience is that men are socialized in an environment of humiliation and shaming that requires protest, and then the protest is suppressed, ridiculed, and humiliated, except when it serves the purposes of the authority or authority group that demands the protest. It's an impossible bind.
And what do you do?
Yeah, what do I do? Exactly. Because I abhor my rage. I do not believe in it. I don't think I have a right to it. Actually, when I brought this up in a therapy session of mine, my therapist reacted to the fact that this man had no mask. That was not what bothered me. And for that moment, and in a rare moment for him, he missed me entirely and was reacting, I think, to his own feelings of vulnerability at being out in the world with people who are not taking care of the common good. But that was not what bothered me. I wasn't worried. I didn't feel he had endangered me. I was stuck with my murderous rage over something that surely no one would condone me killing this man because he had spoken down to me in a dismissive way. But I wanted to kill him. And that tells me something about what I have to learn about. In psychotherapy, it makes sense in the beginning of the therapy, certainly, but really throughout the process. It makes sense for me as a therapist to align with my patient as the victim of destructive intent and action. I don't really believe there's much that people do that they don't intend to do. What I believe is that most of what we do is unconscious. And the intentions, that is the intentions for what we do is unconscious, or at least a significant part of it. But the behavior is carrying an intent, and that intent is communicated to my patient, usually indirectly and through, as one of my therapists once said about how babies learn, through infinite repetitions. In my view, the effect of this kind of chronic relational trauma and the negativity that is infused in those actions is to interrupt development. The work of psychotherapy is not to discharge feeling. In any case, the feelings are not wholly organized because the experience is not completed. My rage at this man is a fragment, is a piece. I would have to go in there, as I have done, and expand that and live out that rage and find those sources of humiliation and degradation and inferiority, investment in me, and respond to those. So the work of psychotherapy can be to complete those experiences, which requires expanding consciousness, deepening feeling, enhancing expression, it's an endless process. There are, at least for me anyway, always more elements to embody. And embody means I feel more of it in more of my body in more and more sophisticated ways. And to do that requires building capacity to fight back. If I side with people's urge to fight back against mistreatment, against exploitation, that requires building strength. Fighting is a skill, and it takes practice, and it takes ego structure, it takes body structure. So building strength, physical, emotional, psychic, and moral, is an ongoing process. Which takes me back around to this pandemic in a way, this pandemic among many others. Our immune system is a self-defense system. We are under constant attack by organisms wishing to use our resources for their own gain. That's a fact of living in an adversarial environment. I don't know if the whole universe is like this. I have no idea. But our universe is definitely like this. So being able to stand up for oneself, to reject domination, humiliation, colonization of oneself are really the same functions as the immune system functions. To build up a capacity to resist predation is not a one-time event or even a multiple-time event followed by peace and prosperity. It's a lifelong process. The thing is, though, that if the focus is only turned outward on the attacker and the attacking forces, the strength we build is limited. It's strength, but it's brittle. At some point, to come to maturity, we have to present our patients with the challenge of encountering their own evil. And I mean that quite explicitly, not in the form of, well, everyone has darkness in them. No, I don't mean it that way. I mean rather an explicit investigation into the nature of that person's destructiveness. And that requires a truthful encounter and investigation of what has been done to us and what we do. Some years ago on my birthday, my son sent me a birthday card that said, "Thank you for all that you do for us and all that you don't do." Nobody would know better, really, I think.
How do you feel?
Well, I'm appreciative for his boundary setting and his guidance, and I am desperately and deeply pained by the harm that I have caused him. Thank you for asking. As a therapist, it's not my responsibility or our responsibility to compel our patients to face this about themselves or to demand that they do something about it. I'm sure most of you listening who are therapists have had the experience of working with someone whose behavior was reprehensible. Treatment of spouses, children, employees, themselves. Not our job to prohibit that or demand a change.
Yeah.
it is our job to be prepared to see it and call attention to it. And that turns out to be quite difficult. Raising our own consciousness and that of the people around us is really a very difficult struggle. And in order to do that, we have to tolerate the evocation of reactions to evil, our own reactions and the reactions of others. So I think it's useful. I'm one of those people who thinks words really matter when they matter. Of course, when they are separated from meaning and from body reality, then they're just whatever they are, but they don't have the meaning and mattering and weight and gravity of words that do have meaning. But when they have meaning, they mean really specific things often. The opposite of evil is not love, and it's not compassion. The opposite of evil is goodness. And goodness, interestingly enough, is a narcissistic function. Goodness is related to power. When a person feels good about himself, what he is saying or she is saying is, I have faith in my goodness. And it is faith at this level, faith in the child's goodness, not love for the child, not care, but respect for the child's unique being and faith in the child's goodness that lends itself to the development of a structure of healthy, positive self-regard. That's the narcissistic function.
Yeah.
And in that is the possibility of connecting to goodness, benevolence, through what we call pleasure. There are many names for it, but I think pleasure is a really good one, as opposed to relief or gratification or even fulfillment, this unique connection to goodness. And then it is possible to deploy power for good. In my generation, many of us on my side of the political spectrum renounced power. And in the early days of bioenergetic analysis, as a kind of alternative psychotherapy, that renunciation was a part of the ideology. But this is a mistake. Power is neutral. Power is force. Power is aggression. Aggression was linked after or before and after the First World War to encroachment, to colonization, to domination. That makes it too confusing. Aggression is force, passionate, good, for good, all possible. But it's something we know in our bodies, so we have to come back to our own experience. The leaders of our two countries, yours there, mine there, and mine here, when they are challenged, they do not say, oh, but we are lovable. They say, I am good, not bad. It's on the dimension of goodness and badness that the judgments have to take place.
Yeah.
So I'll say a bit about my own personal connection to this. 40 years ago, Dick Olney, who was a master therapist, very deep man, not that I didn't have my problems with him, I did.
From Bioenergetic, Dick Olney?
Yes, he was a contemporary of Al's and Stanley's and went his own way.
Cool.
My late wife was very fond of him and appreciative of his orientation.
Cool.
He said to me in the heat of a very intense moment in a workshop, he said, it sounds like you want to know what a shit you are without having to feel bad about it. And I tell you the truth. I sat there and I did not exactly understand what this man had just said to me. But I knew it opened a door. I could see the door open in front of me. And I knew I had to decide if I would enter the room through that door. And since then, I have been exploring that room, finding, even just yesterday, new dimensions of malevolence to which I was exposed and which transformed me.
Like your example, running in the park?
That's right, exactly. That's exactly right.
Cool.
And I have gained considerable knowledge through this process, painfully acquired, about the transformation to malevolence, which is just as significant in this world as the transformation to goodness, which we all hope for. And that informs me, that knowledge informs me. My therapist recently called it a ghastly gift. I thought that was exactly right.
What gift?
Ghastly. Ghastly is like a
Ghastly.
horrible gift.
Horrible.
Gift,
Ghastly.
but it's horrible.
Horrible.
In our work as therapists, we have to confront ourselves with the way people repair their damaged self-esteem systems without acknowledging the wrong that they do. I don't think it's correct to assume that we therapists are any different from anyone else.
Yeah.
Luigi Zoya, in his talk at the last IIBA conference and in his article in the New Journal, he speaks to this issue, I think. And when he was asked at the it was a wonderful talk, profound and brilliant for me. When asked at the conference what hope he saw for us as a species, he took a moment. He really stopped and thought, at least to me it appeared that way, and he found it difficult to articulate a vision of hope. But he endorsed our continuing work to understand and face the sources of human destructiveness. And this is the project we in Bioenergetic Analysis can undertake. I'll give you a little professional example of what I'm talking about.
Perfect.
A young colleague who consults me as a consultant, no longer a supervisor, she's completed her formal training. She represents to me the best of this. She listens to and attempts to make sense of the raging rants of her patient on the current issues of the day. The conspiracy to take power by falsifying the emergence of a pathogen virus.
Wow.
And she treats his maniacal, poisonous, fulminating with the respect due to the communications uttered in psychotherapy, searching for their personal meaning, seeking to connect them to his personal mistreatment. I am focused on his mistreatment of her, worried she is too exposed to harm. But she is persistent. She looks at the danger of the exposure. She looks at her negative reactions to him and looks to see her own negativity. And she is determined to remain open. I am ready to give up on this man, her patient, but each time she brings home to me the importance of her faith in the process born of her very hard work on herself. We both know that there will be no success in this treatment if we do not somehow bring home to this man the harm he causes. In his determination to shield himself, yes, but also those who did harm to him, his parents, his siblings, from exposure, he endangers us all.
Yeah. Very, very difficult situation.
Very difficult. I know for myself that early in my adult life, it took 100% of my energy to fight for my own psychic and emotional survival. Eventually, I could shift to 99% and now perhaps to 98%. This is what is required for me to face and encounter the truth. The demands are different for each of us. We know in our bodies the truth. The first paper I published was entitled The Violence Within Us, and now it forms one of the chapters in a book that I'm writing.
Good.
Thank you. But we cannot know the destructiveness within us only by introspection. We need the information from those we affect. We need to build the capacity to know and to call out what we know. And that capacity to receive is an energetic, is a somatic, is an emotional capacity to breathe in what's being offered to us and to breathe it fully, thoroughly, to the limit of our capacity within ourselves. And I know from much past experience talking to those of you who are my colleagues particularly, that this is a bleak vision in some ways. And on the macro level, I have to admit right now that I feel it is very bleak. And I am very discouraged. But I watch my children, just in the sense that I mean it, strive in their families, in their friendships, to embody the values that they believe in of goodness and care. And I am admiring and I'm encouraged, and I have my struggles with them and they with me, undoubtedly. On the macro level, I find it difficult to feel strength. But on the personal level, I want to end by saying that on the personal level, on the work we do day in and day out with ourselves and with our patients, there are other things to see and to know. So I'm going to end with a quote, because the encounter with evil is part of the larger project of living the life of the body and living in reality. So here is how I end an article I recently submitted. It's being considered for publication now, about my own process and relating that process to my current therapy and to the work of therapy and the theory of therapy.
You will publish in your book?
Well, we'll see. If it's published in the journal, then I'll have to ask them for permission. If it's not published in the journal, then it will be mine to use as I wish. So
good, very nice.
Here is the quote from the end of that article.
Okay.
Many years ago, not long after Elaine and I bought the house in Montauk that became her true home. Montauk is a town at the far east end of Long Island near the sea, where we have a home. That became her true home. We bought a runty-looking Japanese red maple tree. Probably bought it at a yard sale, since we did not have the funds or inclination to purchase nursery-bred trees. It was short, with a narrow trunk and some foliage. It was one of the few species that would have appealed to me. We planted it on a property covered with mature large trees. For years it hung on. It appeared to barely grow despite our ministrations and Elaine's very green thumb. Most things she nurtured thrived.
Green thumb.
Yeah.
Very nice.
Then at some point, maybe 20 years ago, it began to grow, but only the canopy grew. The trunk has remained as narrow in circumference as before, more or less. But now it sports healthy-looking leaves, that unique, bright scarlet red of the species. An impressive display for such a compromised being. I have long felt that that tree was in some way connected to me, was showing the truth of my life in its own. A life in which the foundation cannot be much broadened, the connection to earth and reality expanded that much, but we have made as much with what we have as we can, and continue to. Well, thank you for listening.